If you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to Mark chapter 4. And we're gonna pick up today in verse 35. We're 4 chapters in to Mark, and we just continue to see Jesus for who he is. We continue to see in Mark's vantage point that Jesus is indeed God. In the previous text, Jesus spoke to the people in parables, and his veiled message in these parables immediately preceding our text today was that his kingdom is here, and his kingdom is expanding. And it's important for us to understand that his kingdom is indeed not only going to be here one day, but it is here now. Even though it doesn't always seem like that, it doesn't always look like it, especially with just the weird things going on in the world, but God's kingdom is present, and it's expanding. And it's God's work to expand his kingdom. It's not necessarily our work to expand his kingdom. It's our work to participate in his kingdom, and he uses us for the work of expanding his kingdom, but at the end of the day, it's God's work to expand his kingdom here on earth. And so today we're going to look at a passage that might be familiar to some, and I think an often misinterpreted passage, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But we want to look at, first off, what the text isn't telling us before we get into what the text is telling us. And so let me read the text, and then we'll dive in. Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took with them in a boat, just as he was. And other boats were with them. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking onto the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear, and said to one another, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" What the text is not saying to us is this. This text is often misinterpreted, and a preacher might say something like this after reading the text. Just like Jesus calmed the storm for the disciples, he'll calm the storms of your life. Whatever tribulation you're going through, he'll bring peace. Now, is it true that Jesus can calm the storms of our life? Yeah, absolutely. I've experienced that, and I assume you have as well. Is it also true that Jesus can give you peace? Sure. I've experienced in some of the most difficult times of life an inexplicable peace, other than to say this is from God. But is this text a metaphor for these things? No, it's not. Jesus, prior to this, like I said, spoke in parables, which is just a fancy way to say he was giving them metaphors. But this text is not a metaphor. There's an actual storm that's happening that Jesus actually calmed simply by speaking to it. Right? This is kind of a big deal. So this text is not meant to be a metaphor to say that Jesus will calm the storms of your life. So that's first what the text isn't saying. So what is then the text telling us? So the scene is that Jesus is on a boat with his disciples, and there are other boats in their group. I don't know, did you call that a regalia when there's more than one boat? A bunch of boats crossing the water. Jesus is sleeping, which I find interesting that Mark records that Jesus was sleeping. He was asleep in the stern. And I think first and foremost, just this simple fact alone, it's easy to overlook this, but this simple fact alone shows us something of Jesus' humanity. Right? The Bible tells us that there were times when Jesus was hungry. times when he was anxious, times when he was sad, times when he was disappointed. On our text today, Jesus was obviously tired because he just needed a nap. I was talking to a friend yesterday, now that we're not in our 20s anymore, we were talking about the value of naps. Naps are, I used to hate naps. Naps are awesome at this stage of my life. Sometimes a 10-minute nap is good. Sometimes an hour and a half nap is better, right? When we even going to bed at night, when we sleep, there's something that ought to remind us of our limitations as human beings. Like we need to recharge. We need to rest. And so we see something here of Jesus in his humanity, evidenced just by the simple fact that he was taking a nap. Now, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but Jesus, and we see in this text that we see his humanity, but we also see his divinity. And so the disciples, while Jesus was napping, were having a bit of a freak out moment on the boat. The Bible says that the waves were overcoming the boat and the boat was filling. Now remember that this is not a modern boat with a motor, right? This is a wooden boat, probably with oars, maybe a sail, not a modern boat at all. Now I think I've shared this story before, but many years ago I went fishing out of Depot Bay, and we were on a boat, a modern type boat. And the weather started getting rough, the tiny ship was tossed. The Coast Guard was calling people in. It was that bad. And waves were coming up on the deck of the boat, and it was kind of a freak out moment. And this was a modern boat, and we had life jackets, and they had people there ready to make a rescue in case we dashed into the rocks coming into Depot Bay. It was a bit of a freak out moment. Well, the disciples were on a boat probably without life jackets and no modern engines to navigate the boat. So they're maybe rightfully freaking out in this moment. And in verse 38, it tells us that they woke Jesus and they asked him the question, "Do you not care if we are perishing?" Now, interesting question, because the disciples had spent some time with Jesus. And I wouldn't think that it would be a mystery if, whether he cared about them or not. But they're asking this question, and maybe this was one of those, heat of the moment, just kind of what comes out of your mouth comes out of your mouth. We've all had that, where we've said, kind of dumb things or things that we regret or things that we didn't mean. Could have been one of those moments, but they wake him up and ask him, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" And again, this is easy to overlook as well, but the fact that they would ask that question tells us something of the fact that they haven't quite figured out yet who Jesus is. Because the entire reason that Jesus came into his creation was to save those that are perishing. They hadn't figured it out yet. Now, the Bible tells us that the Lord never slumbers, yet we see Jesus in this moment slumbering, taking a nap. So we see, again, his humanity. We see the humanity of the disciples as they're kind of freaking out about this moment on the boat. And so verse 39 tells us that Jesus awoke, and he rebuked the wind and the sea by saying, "Peace, be still." Now, I don't know about you. I don't like to go to bed, and I don't like to get up, and it takes me a long time to do both. And so I'm not one in the morning to just jump right out of bed, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, or a nap. Like, I don't even, just wake up from a nap and, go do whatever. Like, I got to wind up, after a nap, even a short nap. They woke him, and Jesus just got up and rebuked the wind. "Go away. Peace. Be still." I don't know if he went back to sleep after that. We're not given that details. Probably what I would have done. But he simply spoke to the storm. He called for peace, and he called for it to be still. And do you know what happened? The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. There was peace, and there was stillness that happened simply by Jesus saying, "Peace, be still." And so I find it interesting between verse 38 and verse 39. Verse 38 shows us Jesus' humanity in that he's napping. Verse 39 shows us his deity in that he could just speak to the storm and it stops. Pretty remarkable. There was another time I was also at Depot Bay. I don't know if you've been to Depot Bay, but where 101 goes through Depot Bay, there's a kind of a seawall there. And when the sea's angry, right, the break crashes up and spills over onto the road. And this was one of those days where it was kind of windy and the waves were coming up onto the road. And there was a guy there dressed in his full Scottish outfit with a kilt and everything, playing bagpipes at an angry sea. It was cool. I just stopped and watched for a bit, took some video of it. Just, you don't see that every day. The sea was angry, and his bagpipes were angry, and the guy, like, he was a good bagpiper of such things. Like, he could play, he knew what he was doing. And he was playing at the sea, and it was this, they were both angry. And there was nothing that anybody was going to do to calm that sea. And I kind of picture that moment when I think about Jesus looking at this angry sea, and he just says, "Peace, be still." And it was still. Only God can do that. I can't do that. You can't do that. And so in these two short verses, we see kind of a juxtaposition of Jesus' humanity and his deity at the same time. The theological term that you may know is the hypostatic union. And the hypostatic union is that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. Not 50% God and 50% man, not 60-40 or 70-30, but 100 and 100%. Both God and both man. And it's important that we understand this. And it's also important that we understand it. It's not something that he goes back and forth between, right? Jesus wasn't man when he was taking a nap and God when he was rebuking the sea, right? He exists as fully God and fully man in this moment at the same time. And so Mark is brilliant in giving us just this glimpse into the hypostatic union of Jesus Christ. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14 and 15 tells us this, that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. And he calls us to hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest, the writer writes, who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. So the writer of Hebrews reinforces this idea that we have in Jesus Christ a high priest who has passed through the heavens, right, who is divine. He's passed through the heavens. His name is Jesus. He's the Son of God. And he tells us that this same high priest who has passed through the heavens, that he's not unable to sympathize with our weakness or our humanity. But in every respect, we're told, he's been tempted just like us. Yet he has not sinned. And kind of the faux pas of the disciples in this moment, and Jesus will call this out here momentarily, is that they lack faith. Right? They're on a boat with the Son of God. They're on the boat with the great high priest who has passed through the heavens, yet understands simultaneously the human condition. And they lack faith. And the writer of Hebrews reminds us of this truth of the hypostatic union of Christ and calls us to hold fast to our confession. And the confession that we are to hold fast to is the one that Jesus Christ is Lord. That Jesus Christ has come to rescue those who are actively perishing. And he's come to rescue those who've put their faith and trust in him as Lord. And so the writer of Hebrews tells us to hold fast. Like, don't forget that confession. And I think we can all relate a little bit to the disciples in this moment because we've probably all experienced times where life isn't going our way. And what do we do sometimes in those moments? We get mad at God. We blame God. God, this is your fault. Now, sometimes we ask the question why, and I would advocate that that's a fair question, right? I like to know how things work. I ask why a lot. But asking why is not the same thing as blaming God and being mad at God. And sometimes we get mad at God when things don't go our way or when things are difficult. And the writer of Hebrews is reminding us that Jesus, both in his divinity and his humanity, is for us. And he calls us to draw near with confidence, not to the throne of judgment, but to the throne of grace. And he tells us that when we do that we would receive mercy and we would find grace to help in our time of need. And so often when we're mad at God, we should be drawing near to him in faith and trusting that he knows our circumstance before we tell it to him, right? I'm not saying this is always easy. It's not always easy. But if we understand, Jesus understands us because of his humanity, and he has the power to redeem even the worst of circumstances in his divinity, that should do something for us when things don't go our way. And if the Bible is true when it says that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose, that should allow us to draw near to him in confidence when things are difficult. So yes, Jesus can calm the storms of our life, but Mark is not trying to show us that Jesus can calm the storms of our life. Mark is trying to show us that Jesus is both human and divine. And in his humanity, he can relate to us. In his divinity, he can actually calm a real storm simply by speaking to it. He's showing us something of the power of who God is. And so the disciples freak out. They wake up Jesus. Jesus gets up from his nap, calms the storm simply by speaking to it. And in verse 40, he said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" And I've said this before, but when Jesus asks a question, it's not because he lacks the answer, right? This is Jesus being gracious to those whom he loves, rather than, pointing a finger at them and rebuking them. He just asks a question, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And again, Jesus doesn't lack the answer. He knows. He knows why they're afraid, and he knows that they do actually lack some faith in this moment. Now, it's not a right notion to think as human beings that our faith is always at 100%. I think probably rarely is anybody's faith ever at 100%. Right? We're sinful human beings. We're fearful. We're doubtful. Sometimes we just straight up think we know better than God for things. Right? We're arrogant that way. I don't know if our faith is ever at 100%. And I don't know that God faults us for our faith not being at 100%, because he knows these things about us, yet he loves us anyway. It was no shock to Jesus when he stepped into human flesh and the humans he created rejected him and killed him. He wasn't shocked by that because he knows. He knows why his disciples were afraid, and he knows that their faith in this moment was lacking. And verse 41 tells us that they were filled with great fear. So before, when the waves were coming up on the boat, they were afraid. But now, when they see Jesus do what he did, speak to the storm and see it calm, they were greatly afraid. They were filled with great fear. That moment should have been a moment where they were filled with great faith. That might have been a reasonable expectation after they saw what they saw. That maybe they would have in that moment fell down and worshiped the God of the universe because he could speak to the storm and calm it. But they were filled with great fear. And they said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And evidenced by their question, they still haven't figured out who this is. They haven't figured out fully who Jesus is. They've seen a lot of things 4 chapters into Mark. They've seen Jesus cast out demons. They've seen him heal the sick. Right? They've seen him claim many times his deity. They've seen these things, but they're still asking, who is this guy? Who is it that can speak so that the wind and the sea obey him? I would like to think if I were in this moment that I would have solved the mystery by now. But they hadn't solved the mystery, so I'm guessing that maybe we might not have solved the mystery if we were in this position as well. They've seen enough things that really should have convinced them by now of who Jesus is, but remarkably, they haven't. A.W. Tozer is famous for quipping that the most important thing about you is what comes to your mind when you think about God. The most important thing about you is what comes into your mind when you think about God. Who is God to you? This is a question that we all must wrestle with. Who is God? And depending on who you ask, there could be a myriad of answers to who is God. But more and more, our culture is really shifting to the idea that I am my own God. Right? I'm the captain of my own ship. That's always, like that's nothing new. That's always been a thing. But it seems like culture more and more is moving away from the idea that God is outside of us and beyond us, like beyond our abilities, and God exists inside of us, right? And I get to make up my own rules, and I get to make up my own way. And individualism is strong in our culture today. Other people, when you ask the question, who is God to you, we all have some idea. We have some concept of God, and if it's not you, if you haven't shifted there yet, you might think that God is a lot like you, but maybe a little bit nicer. Maybe a little bit more gracious, maybe a little bit more generous than you. Tim Keller once said that if your God never offends you, then your God is probably just an idealized version of you. If your God never rubs you the wrong way, then your concept of God is that he's way too much like you. We do that, right? We think because I would never do this, therefore a loving God would never do this. And we just kind of make up this kind of idealistic version in our minds of who God is. I think that happens a lot. And one of the reasons that we value expository preaching here and going through the Bible line by line is so that we have a right understanding of who God is. God has revealed himself to us most fully in the scriptures that he's given us. And so if we want to know who God is, we need to know what scripture says about who God is. And we need to be able to interpret it rightly. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, we're told that in the beginning was God. And in the beginning of what? In the beginning of time as we know it, not in the beginning of all things, because God supersedes the beginning of all things. Right? God has always existed eternally, past, present, future. And as finite beings, we can't even wrap our brain around infinity or eternity. We can't wrap our brains around it. But in the beginning, as we know it, there was God. And the Bible tells us that God created the heavens and he created the earth and everything therein. And do you remember how it is that he created all things? Just like he dealt with the storm. He just said, "Let there be," into the nothingness, and there was. We as humanity in the year 2026, we've figured out how to do a lot of things. But we have yet to figure out, how to defeat death. We've talked about that before. We have yet to figure out how to create something out of nothing. We just can't do that. We got to have something in order to create something else. But God, in the beginning as we know it, spoke into the nothingness and said, "Let there be," and remarkably there was. If that's true, we should need no more evidence of his existence and of who he is. But there's a part of us, I think, that doesn't want that to be true. Because if this is true, if God has always been and always will be, and if God has the ability to speak into the nothingness and make something come out of it, the implication is that we must submit to that Creator, and we must be accountable to that Creator. And we don't like that thought, especially as Westerners. We don't,